of a tainted election.
Dictators, corporations, you name it, everybody's against us except President Trump.
Sworn statements were raised as often as the hanky to claim there are pathways to a Trump victory if courts might accept that electronic voting systems were manipulated by foreign communists or that mail-in ballots were systematically rorted in the hundreds of thousands by Democrats.
President Trump won by a landslide. We are going to prove it.
None of the claims has been tested and the president has a backup in case they never are. He's expected to call state Republicans from places like Michigan to ask their legislatures to certify that he won the state, even though he didn't.
He will go down in history as being one of the most irresponsible presidents in American history.
Donald Trump's made only 2 public statements since election night. One of those was to provide an update on coronavirus vaccines. Beyond that, he's had almost nothing to say on the severity of the pandemic. By contrast, Joe Biden's holding frequent and very public events to offer assurances about his intention to provide national leadership. The president-elect summoned governors to discuss money, masks and vaccine distribution.
Hang on, I'm on my way.
Many states can't wait with rising caseloads. New York's schools are shut, restaurants will be next, and the annual mass interstate migration for Thanksgiving next week.
I think that any unnecessary travel should be avoided. In this moment of bringing people together to really limit interactions indoors.
Public health advice is to stay at home, with hampers for the needy to give thanks for small mercies. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Washington.
The US Secretary of State has become the first top American diplomat to visit a Jewish settlement in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, angering Palestinians. Mike Pompeo cleared the way for products here to be labelled as made in Israel and said funding for groups which boycott them would be cut. He also visited the Golan Heights, captured by Israel from Syria in 1967 and later annexed in a move not recognised by the United Nations.
You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized that previous presidents had refused to do, that this is a part of Israel, a central part of Israel.
Mr. Pompeo's visit comes a year after the Trump administration announced it no longer considered the settlements to be contrary to international law, reversing decades of US policy. Well, revelations that Australian soldiers allegedly murdered innocent civilians during the conflict in Afghanistan has angered the Afghan community in Australia. They're now calling for reparations for the families of those impacted. Well, Diana Syed is an international human rights lawyer from Australian Afghan Lawyers Association, and she joins us live from Melbourne. Now, Diana, what have the past few days been like for the Afghan community here in Australia with the release of this report?
Good evening, Yvonne. Thanks for having me here on the show again. Look, it's been a really sombre and sobering reminder of the level of pain and suffering brought to bear on not only the people of Afghanistan, but by extension the Afghan diaspora communities here in Australia. And, you know, what we're seeing here is not anything that we weren't already somewhat aware of. And, you know, what has been happening over decades of the war on terror and the conduct that has, you know, during the intervention since 9/11. And, you know, these atrocities are thoroughly condemnable and should be repudiated in unequivocal terms. And for us, it's just not enough to express mere concern or shock. This goes to the very heart of who we are as a nation.
Well, as an Australian Afghan human rights lawyer, Diana, what was your initial reaction when you heard the details of the crimes committed against Afghanis?
Afghans, Yvonne. Yes, you know, as much as we know that this is actually the tip of the iceberg, and I feel really upset to hear the sort of rhetoric coming out from military personnel talking about a few bad apples. I really would like to say that I don't believe that that is actually the case, that this is what we have actually seen in the 300-plus page report is extensive redaction. But what we have been privy to in the 300-page report is absolutely horrifying. And as much as we know that these sorts of operations have been going on in a cloud of secrecy, the level of detail that we have been privy to is still really just so hard to read. It's so hard to not feel that a massive trust has been severed and moral authority compromised in what should have been, the laws of armed conflict should have been adhered to at all stages of the conflict.
And Deanna, what kind of emotions does it bring up among the Afghan community here, many of whom themselves have fled the country in decades of conflict, as you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think that the diaspora community are really feeling this at different levels, but I really want to focus and centre the actual victims of the alleged war crimes. And, you know, they might not be able to speak out publicly, but they should be heard through any of the criminal investigations that might be brought forward by the Australian Federal Police. In terms of the sentiment, you know, it's just for us here in the diaspora community, the ongoing violence that we have endured as displaced people off of our lands, it's been ongoing now for decades. And this long protracted war, we're still not in a post-conflict era. We still haven't had any capacity or space to recover or to really reconstruct and rebuild our lives. And this is another reminder of how much we have, as Muslims, as Afghans, as refugees, consistently been dehumanised by the media, by different governments, and our lives just don't seem to matter.
There are recommendations for compensation to be made to victims and their families. What could or should that look like in your view?
Absolutely. And as part of those reparations, obviously, the lives of those that have been so unjustly taken can never be replaced. And those families and the victims themselves, you know, reparations will never replace a life. So it's important that that's a welcome first step in acknowledging that justice and accountability must be had as well. And what's really important to bring home as well, that this sort of operation that has been allowed to go on in sort of this culture of ego, elitism and entitlement within this sort of institutional structural framework of our military apparatus, whether it be in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, as you know, Yvonne, this has been my life's work to shine a light and bring sort of attention to bear on these ongoing atrocities and the ongoing violence. For us, really, it actually requires a complete overhaul of our defence forces. And today and yesterday has been a real day of reckoning, and I hope that this causes some real structural and systemic change within our defence forces.
And finally, what's your view on the response from the Australian government so far?
You know, I think that it's a welcome first step. Obviously, we welcomed the inquiry, we welcomed the statement and the apologies from General Angus Campbell and the Afghan government as well. And obviously, you know, a lot of Afghan Australian lawyers will be, you know, watching this, the next sort of what happens next is really important, and to maintain the pressure on the Australian defence apparatus and the government in turn. We're talking not just about low-level commanders. This is a chain of command that comes very much to the higher echelons of our institutional apparatuses. So we really need to, we welcome this first step, of course, but this is just, you know, one step of many that we hope will come where reparations are had, justice and accountability is served to those families and obviously the victims. But it's really important that this also brings about a whole culture shift where this level of impunity and the value of people's lives are respected and the laws of armed conflict are also restored, because otherwise there's just no trust and confidence going forward.
Deanna Sayed, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us on The World.
Thanks, Yvonne.
A former SAS soldier has been fined $700 for making homemade bombs near Bundaberg. 56-year-old David Arthur Beckett appeared in the Hervey Bay Magistrates Court today, charged over bombs, ammunition and firearms seized from an ex-serviceman's camp in Woodgate. His lawyer says Beckett was struggling to adjust to civilian life.
Mr. Beckett had no intention of harming anything or anyone. And again, that information or those facts were put to the court by both the prosecution and the defence, and the court accepted those facts.
Well, he's getting medical help and no conviction was recorded. Officials in Hong Kong say the city's coronavirus situation is severe amid fears of a possible fourth wave. Hong Kong's Secretary for Food and Health says while restrictions aren't foolproof, people should refrain from unnecessary gatherings and activities.
In the past week, we have already tightened many of our measures, including border control measures, quarantine measures, hotel regulation measures, and also some of the social distancing measures. There is no way for it to be watertight. And therefore, we must do more, in terms of at different junctures, at different points in the border control measures before people coming into Hong Kong, for example, requiring pre-departure test.
New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says leaders of APEC nations need to focus on controlling coronavirus if they hope to reopen their economies. Speaking ahead of the summit, Ms Ardern said these decisions will influence how countries fare well into the future.
In these circumstances, when we meet later tonight, all APEC leaders will be focused on having a plan for two things. First, the health response to the pandemic. Getting the virus under control is critical to allowing economies to reopen. And second, driving the economic recovery and building back better. Choices now about how to recover from the crisis will be critical to our well-being in the decades to come.
The federal government's being urged to rethink the way it communicates with women about mammograms. Many say they had no idea free screening was available from the age of 40.
No symptoms and aged in her 40s, Rachel Evagelu thought she had nothing to worry about when she went for a first mammogram, until she got her shock diagnosis.
The cancer I have is a stage 3 cancer, and it is a very aggressive one.
She didn't think she needed to be screened until she was 50, but made an appointment anyway.
A fluke that I even made the phone call. I'd seen a friend's social media post urging her girlfriends to go and book for a mammogram, and the number was there, and I thought, OK, I'll do that.
She wants all women in their 40s to be tested.
And for people that sort of say, I don't have time to do a breast check, I don't have time to go to the GP, I don't have time to have a mammogram, it's too inconvenient. I'm really sorry, but chemo is far more inconvenient than having a breast exam.
Jodie Shepherd and Belinda Barnier have also been diagnosed with breast cancer. They are pleading with the federal government to send alerts a decade earlier, so women from the age of 40 know they can access publicly funded mammograms.
Everyone thinks that it's only people over 50 that are eligible for this service that saves lives.
Yeah, there's a really big gap in the messaging, and I'm not going to rest till it changes.
The head of the federal government-run Cancer Australia, Professor Dorothy Keefe, told the ABC communicating the free mammogram service was tricky and a little bit complicated. She said alerting women to the free test would not be cost-effective, and it would lead to a lot more screening of women less likely to have breast cancer. Around 19,800 Australian women are diagnosed with breast cancer each year. 16% are aged in their 40s. Rachel, who goes by Cancer Pin-Up Doll on social media, endured her first round of chemotherapy this week, defiantly dressed in a 1950s ensemble. because her cancer fight will take time, but it won't take her identity. Talia Roy, ABC News, Canberra.
Queensland's first charter flight of international farm workers are hard at work to help with this summer's harvest, but thousands more are needed to ensure fruit doesn't go to waste. The Tongan nationals were able to work during their 2 weeks of quarantine to urgently address the country's farm labour shortage.
Saving Queensland's grape harvest bunch by bunch. These workers are nothing but grateful to be in Australia.
I want to make money for my family, for my young sister and young brother, pay school fees, also pay rent for the home.
150 Tongans arrived in Emerald last month as part of the restarted Pacific Labour Scheme. The industry says about 7,000 workers are needed.
For Queensland and Australia, we need a lot more farm workers all over.
Queensland is the second state to fly in international workers, but the first to allow them to work while quarantining for 2 weeks.
The entire cohort was completely isolated from the entire rest of the farm. They were completely isolated from the packing. They had their own transport and logistics, their own food production.
The Tongan nationals had to undergo 2 COVID-19 tests. After Emerald, they'll work on farms in other parts of Queensland.
I think it was a relief to offer a pilot for a very desperate industry that needed some relief, and to see that something came off successfully and it can be done.
The industry relies heavily on foreign workers, and travel restrictions have created a severe shortage for farmers.
Hard to fathom just at this point in time, but it does mean that the product isn't rotting on the vine.
Emerald was identified as a location in most urgent need of workers for this summer's harvest. At least 3 other flights are due to land in Queensland before the season is out to help with the state's farm worker shortage. It's not yet known where or when they're due to land.
So there's thoughts potentially for flights coming in to service North Queensland, again in Central Queensland, and somewhere again in Southern Queensland.
Ensuring fruit will be on the shelves in time for summer. Meg Bolton, ABC News, Emerald.
For young men who find themselves in the youth justice system, the future doesn't always look too bright, but a new program has been introduced at the Malmesbury Youth Justice Centre to help sweeten that outlook by training them to be beekeepers. Eden Heinonen reports.
These bees are busy building a hive in an unusual place. Here at the Malmesbury Youth Justice Centre, these young men are learning the art of beekeeping.
We're teaching up to a Certificate 3 level in beekeeping within the justice system, and so our young people are coming out very well educated and ready to start working in the beekeeping industry.
Claire Moore is the beekeeper behind Sweet Justice, a program that aids the rehabilitation of disadvantaged youth.
I've been genuinely surprised how quickly they're picking up really difficult theory. They're very intelligent and moving really quickly.
Classes involve building hives, learning how to extract honey, and developing the skills needed to run their own business.
What's something about the bees themselves that you've learnt?
Basically, if we don't have bees, we don't have food, and then we don't live, because bees pollinate the majority of the foods and flowers.
It's hoped the students will learn the skills needed to gain full-time employment in a shrinking industry.
The average age of a beekeeper in Australia is 65, and we don't have a lot of young blood in the industry. So I'm hoping that some of these people and the young people trained at Malmesbury will be part of the next generation of commercial beekeepers.
A similar beekeeping program in the United States resulted in reoffending rates plummeting.
2 young boys who have already gone through the program have already been headhunted and offered jobs.
This is the first time a program like this has been run at a youth justice centre in Australia, but Claire Moore hopes that more centres will get on board so that young people around the country can learn how to handle a hive. Sweet dreams for the future. Eden Heinonen, ABC News, Malmesbury.
It's been a year many can't wait to see gone, but at least 2020 has provided endless fodder for the country's political cartoonists. Today, their best creations were unveiled in this year's Behind the Lines exhibition at Old Parliament House.
From the devastating bushfires to COVID-19, 2020 has certainly been a dog's breakfast.
It's been quite a grim, quite unrelenting rolling series of chaos events, and so certainly we've looked at opportunities to bring out a bit of humour.
At the start of the year, the country was burning, and cartoonists couldn't resist taking aim at the Prime Minister and his Hawaiian holiday. By March, Australia was well and truly in the grips of a global pandemic. Lockdown, social distancing and hoarding were hot topics. The role of political cartoonists is not only to provide comic relief, it's also to rock the boat, and that takes guts.
Whenever I think that I might want to avoid a topic because it might get me flack, that's possibly a good moment to think maybe I will take it on.
One of the curator's top picks is Kathy's cartoon, The New Casual, a look at the privatisation of nursing homes and the spread of coronavirus. It was so confronting, The Age in Melbourne chose not to run it. Penny Wong's eyebrows get a mention, so too does the gift that keeps on giving outgoing President Donald Trump.
That was probably the biggest challenge, was finding that balance that was both insightful but also not going to drag us down to where we were.
And while memories of this hellish year will thankfully fade, these insightful cartoons won't. Rosie King, ABC News, Canberra.
Australian all-rounder Glenn Maxwell says COVID restrictions will do nothing to dampen Australia's cricketing rivalry.